issues at hand. That means a civil, contextualized conversation with perspective.
Tonight, we're live in Florida as people prepare for Hurricane Idalia, the latest on the storm's path. Then, what prescription drugs could get cheaper as Medicare negotiates prices for the first time, and the technology that could save lives in a school safety emergency on the CBS.
Never stop fighting for you on this issue.
If you really want to do something about these mass shootings, then we need to get these weapons of mass destruction, the AR-15s, the semi-assault style weapons, out of the hands of these killers.
This administration wants to sweep what happened under the rug. They know they bear the brunt of the blame, and they want to escape any accountability. Well, I will not let that happen.
Hello and welcome. I'm Nancy Cordes in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. The Biden administration has announced the first 10 drugs subject to Medicare price negotiations. The list includes diabetes and heart medications, as well as drugs for preventing blood clots. The move is expected to cut costs for patients in a couple of years. In a speech today, President Biden said the program is a, quote, long time coming. For more on this, senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now. Hey, Ed, good to see you.
Good to see you, Nancy.
So, people who don't take these drugs might still recognize some of the names from all the ads. We're talking about Eliquis and Xarelto and Enbrel and Stelara. Give us some insight into how these particular 10 drugs were chosen.
Right. Well, remember, this is all an outgrowth of the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year. And in essence, it now allows Medicare over the next several years to announce plans to negotiate for lower drug prices with the manufacturers. This is the first tranche of them. As you said, popular medications that people probably know best from television, but are also quite helpful and essential for people with diabetes, certain heart diseases, certain cancers. The criteria essentially says that the drugs that ultimately will be negotiated over, the ones that are costing Medicare the most, have been on the market for years, don't necessarily face competition from rivals, so they may be the only one available in essence. And there will be others announced at some point next year. What's interesting here, though, is that while they will announce the new prices roughly this time next year, maybe in the fall of 24, right before the elections, the actual change in price won't kick in until 2026. And you might sit there and go, why so long? Well, it's going to take a little while to negotiate this, first of all. Second, the companies have to adjust. But the hope White House officials signaled today is that once Medicare announces the new prices, maybe all the private insurers will go, well, okay, we'll bring down our price too. And so market forces will essentially force this to happen a lot sooner, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act was hoping to do by getting this language put in there.
And we know that some of these pharmaceutical companies are being dragged along kicking and screaming and have already filed lawsuits to try to prevent these negotiations from happening. But how does President Biden convince Americans on the campaign trail that this is a big deal when, as you pointed out, these price cuts don't actually kick in until well after the 2024 election in 2026?
This is one of the big assumptions and real risks that this White House is taking between now and Election Day 2024, because not only is there inability to see or enjoy the potential savings when it comes to your medicine, there's no ability to necessarily yet to see or enjoy the infrastructure changes that have happened in communities across the country because the projects are still just getting started. Maybe the electric vehicles are still a theory for many people, but not necessarily being used, or the charging stations that are being put in place by the legislation passed in recent years aren't there yet. So he's gambling that over the next year, once people start thinking more about the elections, and once this money starts getting spent, he can turn and say, hey, did you notice that? Did you notice this? Did you know that, grandma or your uncle who depends on this medication is going to see those cost savings? That's because of the work we did. Keep us in power, and we'll make sure that all of these things continue to get implemented, and we can do even more. But you're right. It's going to take a while, and it's part of the reason why this White House believes ultimately his numbers will improve as people start to see the real-world savings that won't kick in still for several years.
Well, no matter what, it is a major development that Medicare will now, for the first time, be able to negotiate these drug prices. Probably a lot of Americans out there scratching their heads wondering why this wasn't happening already. Ed O'Keefe at the White House, thanks so much.
Take care.
House Majority Leader Steve Scalise says he's been diagnosed with a form of blood cancer. The Louisiana Republican is undergoing treatment and described the condition as, quote, very treatable. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane joins us now here in the studio. Hey, Scott, good to see you, but bad news for Mr. Scalise, who has already gone through so much medically after that shooting a few years ago and his long-term recovery. What can you tell us about this situation?
The majority leader of the U.S. House, who works a necessarily tireless job, says he will work through this, through his recovery, through his treatment. He has all kinds of support from his colleagues of both parties, some very supportive statements for Majority Leader Scalise today. 6 years ago, he was shot. And he is still, you can see, visibly impacted by that horrific shooting. He walks with a different gait, he moves a little more slowly in the hallways, but his job is uniquely difficult at this moment. Being House Majority Leader would probably be one of the more stressful jobs in America. He does it with a remarkably narrow margin to navigate as well. Steve Scalise, I'll underscore this, is one of the members working through cancer at this moment in time. There are others. Congressman Castro of Texas is not yet cancer-free as he undergoes treatment for cancer. Just recently, Congressman Kildee of Michigan, Congressman Raskin of Maryland have been declared cancer-free. It's what American workplaces deal with.
Right.
It is a microcosm of America, and Steve Scalise is a microcosm of the American worker now.
Right, a real reflection of what so many Americans are going through. I want to ask you, as we have this hurricane bearing down on Florida, about FEMA funds. The FEMA director was in the White House briefing room today. Let's listen to a little bit of her, and then you've been doing some reporting on FEMA funding.
Right now, the supplemental request that we have put in is $12 billion, and that will be a bridge to get us through the end of the fiscal year. If we continue to see more storms, we're going to continuously monitor very closely the health of the Disaster Relief Fund to determine what more may be needed. But
Hawaii wildfires, not cheap. Now you've got potentially another major disaster bearing down. What is the situation? Does FEMA have the money it needs?
As this night began, sources tell me that there is grave concern in Congress that they don't have the political ability at this moment to replenish that disaster fund quickly. Every September, FEMA runs low on money. It's just the end of the fiscal year. It's how things go. It gets so dire starting today because of this hurricane. FEMA has now officially paused spending on long-term recovery in some of these areas that were just bludgeoned in July. Think of Vermont, Hudson Valley of New York, horrible floods, other wildfires elsewhere in America. They have to pull back long-term FEMA projects because they need to use the rest of their money, a few $1 billion, towards hurricane preparations to ensure nobody dies. Maui wildfires, it's still an emergency situation. The next few things coming where life and death is on the line. They can hold off and pause the longer-term things where there's no longer lives on the line. But in a state like Vermont, tax base is low. There are still enormous expenses they need federal help for. FEMA now just hit the snooze button, which is going to disrupt things. And normally, in a normal time, you covered Congress for so many years, Congress would move swiftly to get emergency money passed. This Congress just doesn't have a record of moving swiftly on anything, emergency or otherwise.
Right. They were already facing the possibility of a government shutdown at the end of September.
The
Another
likelihood.
big, and you put it at likely. That's troubling. But this is just another chink in the armor, and we got a couple more months left in hurricane season. Scott MacFarlane, thank you so much. Miami Mayor Francis Suarez is now the first GOP presidential hopeful to drop out of the race. Suarez launched his 2024 bid just over 2 months ago. His withdrawal comes after he failed to meet the requirements for the first primary debate. Well, it's a familiar refrain, but the U.S. is once again reeling from a series of mass shootings. Coming up next, we'll talk possible solutions with Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy. You're streaming America Decides.
If it's what's important to our nation.
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
It's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag Oscar So White was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, oh, we're going to tell you about that, too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology. So advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast. Streaming on CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether,
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
Welcome back to America Decides. On Sunday, I spoke with former Vice President Mike Pence, and he told me he wants to expedite the death penalty process for mass shooters. Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy joins me now. Senator, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I want to start with a topic that's very important to you, and that's gun violence. Just in the past 48 hours or so, we saw a professor at UNC gunned down. We saw a racially motivated mass shooting in Jacksonville, Florida over the weekend. And on Face the Nation, I asked former Vice President Mike Pence what he thinks can be done, and he called for what he called a, quote, expedited federal death penalty for anyone engaged in a mass shooting. I'm wondering what you think of that proposal.
Well, it shows how little Mike Pence understands about the gun violence epidemic in this country. The fact of the matter is most mass shooters are engaged in a suicide attempt. Most mass shooters are intending to either kill themselves or be killed by police. And so Mike Pence doesn't know what he's talking about when he says that he thinks mass shootings will go down if you threaten to kill the people who are carrying them out. They are, in fact, seeking to die. And so the most important thing we can do right now is just make sure that those mass shooters don't have access to military weapons. The fact of the matter is, if you walk into a crowded place with an AR-15, you are going to kill 5-10 times more people than if you had a gun that was equipped with only a 10-round magazine, a pistol, for instance. And so if you really want to do something about these mass shootings, then we need to get these weapons of mass destruction, the AR-15s, the semi-assault style weapons, out of the hands of these killers.
Is there any candidate in the GOP field who you think would be willing to work with Democrats on the issue of gun safety?
I'm not familiar with all of the positions on guns of the Republican candidates. What I do know is that the Republican Party is in the midst of a change. Probably 5 years ago, we couldn't have gotten more than 1 or 2 Republican votes on a measure that the NRA opposed. But last summer, as you know, we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. It's 5 pretty major changes in American gun laws. Every single one of those changes was opposed by the NRA. And we got 15 Senate Republicans to vote for that measure. I'm sure some of them have presidential ambitions. And so I think you'll see more Republicans, maybe even more Republican presidents in the future, supporting changes in our gun laws because they really aren't interested in running in general elections when the electorate is so firmly decided. The general electorate really wants universal background checks and assault weapons bans, and I think that's just going to become more and more clear to Republicans who are running.
When we look at an incident like the Jacksonville shooting, we're obviously talking about 2 issues, not just gun violence, but also racial hatred, which seems to be on the rise in this country. Do you think there's a role for Congress to play in tackling that problem, or is that more of a societal ill that needs to be addressed in other ways?
Well, there's absolutely a role for political leaders to take here. The fact of the matter is we have a leading candidate for president on the Republican side who glorifies the use of violence and in particular the use of political violence. Donald Trump celebrated the attacks on January 6th. He cheered on the racist protesters in Charlottesville. Every single leader at the federal level needs to divorce themselves from the use of political violence and needs to renounce candidates for office that celebrate political violence. So unfortunately, on the right, political violence has been mainstreamed, and that provides a kind of license to people like the shooter in Florida to take out their rage on vulnerable communities.
Do you think that politicians on the right are doing enough to speak out against that?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Again, the very fact that Donald Trump remains the leading Republican candidate, having really made his candidacy based upon his celebration of political violence, tells you that the right is just not taking seriously the way in which violence and right-wing politics are stirred together today.
I want to ask you about another big development today, and that's the fact that the Biden administration named the first 10 drugs that will be subject to new price negotiations with Medicare to try to bring down Medicare costs starting in 2026. As you know, an array of drug makers are already suing the administration over this. So what do you think the chances are that they're going to be able to head off this effort altogether before we ever even get to 2026?
I'm not intimately familiar with these lawsuits, but from what I know, they seem fairly meritless. There's no question the federal government has the power to use the bulk purchasing ability of Medicare to drive down prices. I've been listening to my Republican colleagues for years say that we should run government like a business. Well, that's exactly what we're doing. It's really wild that we didn't take all of the Medicare purchasing power, pool it together to push prices down, and then use those savings to reduce costs for seniors. We're finally doing that with 10 drugs. I'm hopeful that this is going to be very successful. I'm hoping that the price of those drugs will come way down and that next Congress will come back and will expand this ability so that we can do it for another 10 and another 20 drugs. The drug industry hates this because they've been running roughshod over taxpayers, making huge profits off of all of us. And finally, we're just, infusing some common sense into the way that we run Medicare policy. It's a good start.
Yeah, I was trying to think today of any other area where the government doesn't use its purchasing power to try to drive costs down. I mean, the government enters into all kinds of contracts in areas other than prescription drugs where, it is it has a big footprint and is able to use that leverage.
And as you know, the failure of Medicare to use its bulk purchasing power is due to a line in a 2003 law which banned the federal government from doing just that, pooling together all Medicare beneficiaries and driving down the price. And that was a gift to the drug industry. In 2003, when we expanded Medicare to include prescription drugs, the price that the drug industry exacted to support that law was a ban on bulk negotiation. And so it shouldn't have taken as long as it did, 20 years, to get rid of that statute. But we finally are doing the right thing for seniors.
An important first step. Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's been a little over 2 years now since the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Up next, the House Committee Chairman investigating what happened leading up to the deadly bombing that killed 13 U.S. service members. He joins us next.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony Dvoldar from Queens.
Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman.
Thank you for joining us on Person to Person. Tennis superstar and entrepreneur Serena Williams.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom. We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job? I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education.
If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
Calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my 2 good friends, and we talk about the world.
Refused to continue a war that was no longer in the service of the vital national interest of our people. I refuse to open another decade of warfare in Afghanistan.
Welcome back to America Decides. It has now been 2 years since the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. The Biden administration defends the move, while Republicans say the withdrawal was chaotic and a failure. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul held a roundtable this afternoon with families of the 13 U.S. service members who lost their lives during a terrorist attack at Kabul's airport during the withdrawal. The congressman joins us now. He serves as the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Chairman McCaul, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Nancy.
So 2 years later, what lessons have we learned from the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, we're raising more questions than answers, quite frankly. I started a very aggressive investigation once I became chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We heard powerful testimony
from the parents of these children who were killed in the massive suicide bomb attack that killed 13 service members, wounded 45 others, and then killed 170 Afghans. This is a massive explosion. And every time, the more we investigate, the more questions are raised. For instance, the sniper who testified, Tyler Vargas Andrews, testified that he had the suicide bomber in his sights and the sniper team as well. And they sent pictures to get permission to engage the suicide bomber. The commanding officer, who we've scheduled to interview early in September, said he didn't have that authority. So there was no permission to engage. And then 2 hours later, the bomber went off. In addition, there was intelligence that ISIS-K was in a hotel room in Kabul plotting the suicide bombing attack. And again, the military requested an airstrike be conducted. That request was denied also at the higher level. So twice we had an opportunity to prevent this. And that's what's so hard on these families, is the fact that it could have been stopped. It didn't have to happen. And they deserve the answers. The American people are listening to them. Congress is listening to them. But the administration needs to listen to them and give them the answers they deserve.
The military might argue that it's easy to go back in hindsight and take a look at the various pieces of evidence and information that were there at the time. It was on this fog of war as they were working to withdraw before the deadline, and they knew that the Taliban was making its way into the city. Realistically, what kinds of lessons do you think the military and the administration should draw from this experience?
And I think that's a great question, because eventually what they want to know, the family members, they want us to come up with solutions so that this never, ever happens again. Now, the original decision to withdraw, the top generals and intelligence community did not agree with that decision. Having said that, if you're going to do this, do it right. And it was rushed under this false artificial timeline, and it led to this chaos that we saw at the airport. We saw the people hanging from the airplane, falling from the sky, and then the suicide bomber attack. What we found is that the State Department is supposed to lead this evacuation, and yet they don't even request that evacuation plan from the DOD until 2 days after the fall of Kabul. They waited too late, and it was so chaotic and dysfunctional that nobody knew who was in charge, whether it be DOD or state, and that led to all the confusion on the ground that ultimately led to this suicide bomber attack at Abbey Gate.
Earlier this month, you actually sent a letter to the State Department saying that they had failed to comply with your committee's subpoena. You were seeking after-action review files on the withdrawal. Have you since gotten those files or any transcribed interviews?
I have. I had a very serious talk with Secretary Blinken. I think we had a meeting of the minds that we can play this game of subpoena and try to hold them in contempt, or they can just be honest with Congress and the American people and start producing the documents that we've requested. So they have started to produce these documents, many of them in the classified space, which I would argue they don't have to be classified. And the family members deserve this. But we also got movement from, I got a call from General Milley about, the Gold Star families. I think they're starting to finally pay attention to this because the families are speaking out. And, I said, why are the Marines not allowing us access to the commanding officer who denied permission to take out this threat of the suicide bomber? Finally, after 6 months, we were finally going to get access to him. But there's so many more questions we need answers to. And we're going to take this all the way up to the highest part, the highest chain of command.
I want to make sure to ask you about Ukraine before you go. Last week, Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy said he would accept Russia taking control of some Ukrainian territory, and he'd also end U.S. sanctions on Russia if that's what it takes to end the war in Ukraine. What do you think of this approach?
Well, I think that would be a surrender to Russian aggression, just like we surrendered to the Taliban. And this is not just about Russia and Putin. It's about Chairman Xi and China and their unholy alliance. And when I went to Asia, what happens in Ukraine will impact what happens in Taiwan. I think that is a very risky foreign policy. What I did notice at that debate was that 6 of the 8 candidates were very strongly supportive of our efforts to contain Russian aggression. And then the last candidate was somewhere on the fence that if Europe stood up to the plate more, that he would be supportive. So we have a supplemental before us. There was no collaboration with Congress. You know, I've talked to the Speaker about this, and we're going to take a look at it, but we're not going to rubber stamp or write a blank check. But they need the input of Congress, who has the power of the purse authority. So I anticipate we're going to be looking at this closely. I do anticipate you will see something that will pass before the end of the fiscal year as Ukraine is in this counteroffensive movement. I just wish the administration had given them the weapons they needed a year and a half, 2 years ago, because we probably would be in a very different situation today.
It's interesting to hear that you do think that this supplemental will pass eventually. Congressman McCall, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. Thanks for having me.
And that does it for today. You can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. And thanks for watching. You're streaming CBS News.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals.
How did you deal with being discriminated against?